You know, the downside of, actually the downside of being short is I always have to change this. The downside of following a bunch of smart people is probably most of the good points have been made, so a lot of this stuff will be a reiteration. And I promise you I didn't steal anybody's slides, though you'll see a lot of similarities in some of the things that have been mentioned over the last couple of days. I am going to try and take this, first of all, I caveat this, that not all of this is an official Elsevier perspective. As you can see here, I come as, yes, Vice President for Corporate R&D, but I'm also a member of the Board of Directors for Pistoia. And my first job, actually as a real job, was with Netscape way back when. So I've been working towards the proliferation and dissemination of data, ideally freely, but at least simply, for the duration of my career. I'll talk a little bit today about the bigger picture. And I mean, Eric touched on this, Mike touched a bit on this. It's really more around going from data, from facts, from generation, to what that actually means to a business, and ultimately what it means to, and I've mentioned this before, to the society in general. Again, all of us here have to recognize that our businesses have significant impacts. And because they have significant impacts, they're asking big questions. There's a lot of things down in the weeds that are important to get to those big questions. But ultimately, we have to look at how to best serve the big picture for pharma, the big picture for life science, the big picture for collaboration. Everyone sees and knows, at least most everyone in this room knows from a pharmaceutical development perspective, that there are a number of milestones. You can look at early discovery, you can look at target identification, biomarker identification, genotypic and phenotype stratifications, all the way through lead molecule or lead compound or lead identification, doing safety studies, preclinical pharmacology, then the awesome and immense expense of clinics, only to find out, you know, once it gets to market, you still have to look at it, monitor it very carefully. There's tons and tons of systems that support every one of these, and we've talked about these. We talk about lab instrumentation and the importance of being able to carry over data from one instrument to another and into a LIMS system or into some kind of ELN. But if you really look at what pharma is trying to do, they're trying to bridge these things. They're trying to derive an insight so that you can identify a potential signal detection from post-launch and bring that back into discovery, right? How to answer the big questions, how to answer the question, we talked briefly about the moonshot, and I love that. You give some guy $10 billion and a remit to go cure cancer. You know, they're not gonna be looking at the detail of the lab instrumentation data to each individual system. They're going to be taking it up to a much higher level, and we'll be talking about that. That's not to diminish the importance of the smaller or the individual silos. But at the end of the day, we need to equally look at how to bridge the data between these silos, how to give the information that is generated from one group to where it's relevant to another. I had a great discussion with a guy named Stephen Pike, who runs about 1,800 data analysts at GSK. And he had a great statement. He said, we're really, really good at collecting data for an individual purpose. We suck at making it available for everything else. And he gave a great example of that. He talked about the Oracle Empirica system, which is the way that they capture all of their post-market intelligence. He said this wealth of data that could be used for signal detection is available in one data store to the 5 people who have licensed access to the application. What a waste. That's why they bring in people like Mark Ramsey as a chief data officer to address that level of need, how we can talk about looking at a big picture. And I love this statement, and I have to say, I do talk to GSK a lot, so I have a lot of GSK quotes, certainly not biased towards them, right? Every one of you who dedicates your life in pharma knows the failure rate, knows full well that you could work your entire career on something promising that doesn't become a drug, right? Now, we heard the paradigm. I didn't understand this when I first joined the community 20 years ago, that pharma wants to fail early. That made no sense to me. Pharma doesn't want to fail at all, right? They want to succeed more quickly. But the idea that all of the data that they have available to them should be able to better be assimilated to predict where they should have known they would fail. And let's be honest, we don't address that in the community. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, how we can maybe bridge that gap to open up all of the data that's available. This is the promise of these supercomputers. This is the promise of things like Watson. Pour in all the data and give me the real answer that I'm looking for. We talk about big data, and again, I really like what Eric said. It really isn't about big data. It's about big analysis. It's about enabling that analysis. I remember when I saw Larry's presentation, I guess it was about a year ago, I was in awe of all of the data that was being captured by the FDA. And then I actually just started asking around to see how prevalent that is in the discovery environments of the community. And I was really bummed that it's not nearly as utilized as it should be. It's killer data, right? We've got all of these sources of data. We've got data that's externally generated. We've got data that's published on a daily basis from academic research. We have data that's internally generated. How do we tie that all together so that GSK can use it, Roche can use it, Amgen can use it, right? It's not just about pre-competitive sharing, but it's about tying all of the data together that actually fulfills the big mission: get a therapy out to market. The problem is that it's easy to look at the individual silos of data. You have people in lab management, you have people very vertical in R&D IT, you have people in early stage discovery, you have R&D IT now that supports just individual groups. Who's looking at the big picture? I mean, there are folks that are looking at that. I had a great opportunity to talk to Michael Dolston, who's global head of R&D at Pfizer. And when we were talking, he said his #1 priority is to figure out how to get more value out of all the data they have, not the data Elsevier sells them or anyone else, but the inherent belief that somewhere in there is something that their scientists, through good science, discovered, but overlooked in their application. And that's the critical thing. We see these silos in drug discovery. Medicinal chemistry is in one piece. The target identification, the biomarkers, the early stage discovery folks, the people who are doing phenotypic stratification. Where's the overlying strategy in this? I'm seeing more and more that companies out there are looking at developing that big picture strategy. Again, I mentioned Pfizer, GSK, bringing in somebody like Mark Ramsey, who's coming only from a data perspective. He's not coming from life science at all. So he's coming from outside the industry to build their data strategy. Bayer, very clear that they have a very large data strategy. At the Pistoia Alliance, we actually had, about a year and a half ago, something like 11 of the major pharmas present their strategy, to what they felt comfortable sharing. And it was awesome to see what it was. And it was exactly this: bridging these data sets and data types to actually create an answer for somebody who's asking a question. Not an answer based on the data that they would typically see, but an answer based on any relevant data. It's a huge, huge task. I think Mike talked about this from the very beginning, right? At the end of the day, innovation in large pharma has always been, let's just look at what the other guy does and try and do it like that. I have to say, with all due respect to my marketing colleagues, and I have a lot of marketing colleagues, nobody's marketing touches IBM. The promise of IBM Watson: I can take in anything, I can answer anything, I will answer the big questions. You just throw all the data in here and somehow press the button, cure cancer. Press the button, find a drug. Most of you are scientists. If only it were that easy. And yet, you see, and again, I'm by no means critical of Watson. They have some really smart guys there. I know some of them. And it's the same with new systems, Palantir, NVIDIA, Cray, or whatever Cray has become. The computational capability is there. It's the context that's missing. I was talking to somebody, a good friend of mine now, who's over at Accenture. And I asked him the question, I said, how often do you get called in to analyze why Watson fails? And he says, yeah, all the time, right? You see all these headlines right here. How many companies have brought in Watson on their cancer therapies to really make a big impact? What I haven't seen is the headline that said, here's the result, and it's a big impact, right? That's not to criticize Watson. It's to ask all of us how we can better enable these tools. We all have the same goal. You know, at the end of the day, I want the therapies coming out to market. And we talked about having data scientists on board, right? And that's great. I've got a small group of really smart people. Most of you guys have big groups of really smart people. We hire data scientists. We hire people with the idea of working with big data. But there's still a huge disconnect between what the analytics of this actually means and what the business objective is, right? The business objective, to repurpose a drug, to find a new indication, to be able to identify something that we might have pulled out of consideration for a drug because it only had a 25% success rate. Knowing now that if we can identify those 25 people via a biomarker, via a phenotypic or identifier, a genotypic identifier, we can bring a drug to market that's going to have 90% success, just in a smaller patient population. Right? Those are things we couldn't have done 20 years ago. The data will allow us to do that, but we have to figure out how to get that data in there. We have to figure out how to use the data scientists correctly, intelligently, and where they have the bigger impact. Sorry, this is going to be another GSK reference, but I thought it was actually really cool, right? We look at technology, and Steve mentioned technology and the Internet of Things, but where do you really see the out-of-the-box thinking? So this is McLaren, right? McLaren is an F1 race team. About a year and a half, John Baldoni at GSK said, you know, the amount of per-second telemetry that we're getting at McLaren that allows the McLaren guys to feed back to the drivers and the mechanics, hey, real quick, let's make a change. We see the brakes going. We see all of this information that we can store and react to, not only to help us at the point that we're getting it, but then downstream how we change our processes, how we change our mechanics. Can we apply that same level of thinking at GSK? So they actually went on they announced a 2-year collaboration, and they're trying to do exactly the same methodologies, learning the telemetry methodologies from McLaren and applying them to GSK. Now, in pharma, that's always a little bit tricky because as soon as you do anything that's patient-facing and you find out that you're getting instant feedback, there's going to be an expectation from the patient that you're going to be able to do something about it. So that's always a little bit on the tricky side. But that's really out-of-the-box thinking. And that's the kind of thing when you come back to your respective offices, maybe think a bit bigger picture. What do I know from the Internet of Things outside of my daily work that I can apply as maybe a new idea? I thought that was just worth segueing into. Right, again, going back to Watson, we bring in these supercomputers, we bring back computational capabilities that were unheard of 10 years ago, and of course will be archaic 10 years from now. But what are we expecting? And I have to say, before I joined the community, I didn't understand this either. I thought it should be fairly simple to create a drug. I mean, how many things can happen? Yeah, well, I was wrong, clearly. On a chessboard, we all know that IBM Watson got kind of famous first for winning at chess, then winning at Jeopardy, which I guess is a little bit cooler. But if you look at a chessboard as the analogy, there's 32 pieces and 64 spaces. On any given situation, there's only so many things that can happen. I mean, if you start throwing leads at biological targets, it's an almost infinite set of things. And then, as somebody was saying the other day, I mean, again, as we get older and we have to start thinking about people taking 5, 6, 7 medicines in a population we've never tested against, 75-year-old people who are going to be growing to be 85, 90, and the permutations are almost incalculable. That's the challenge, right? And then the other challenge you have is, at the end of the day, if you work 15 years to get a drug out, you want that drug to get out to market. You want to test it on the healthiest possible person to make sure that it's actually going to pass and get out there. How does the computational capability help you then? So Mike talked about the 5 W's, all of which are the same. Why? 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 Why do you want to do this? What are you trying to accomplish? In our work with the customers who've been working with Watson, the customers who've been working with Palantir, we've looked really carefully at this. And it's across the board. They make the, I don't want to say the claim, but they make the promise that if you put all of this scientific information, something good is going to come out of it. Then we just have to sift through it. And that's why those are million-dollar projects, because the sifting requires people like you. And they bring in hundreds of them. They bring in consultants, they bring in an army of people. But this is important because some of the time when you're looking at what we're really looking for, this goes right to Eric's point and other people's point. You have to have a semantic lens on this, right? You capture data fit for a purpose, and that purpose may be a discovery biologist. That purpose may be a medicinal chemist. That purpose, you know, may be somebody doing some level of patient stratification for epidemiology studies, right? Could be anything. How do you then tie that data back to everybody with whom or to whom it could be relevant? So you consider the sources in the ecosystem, right? There's public data, there's published research. At Elsevier, we publish 25% of the world's science, technology, and medicine in published literature. So, I mean, we have skin in the game. You collaborate with tons of people. We collaborate with every university on Earth. We would like to think that everyone would consider putting their data somewhere in an Elsevier source. So, I mean, that's important. There's always downsides to that. Publishing 25% of the data means we publish 25% of the non-reproducible data, or more, you know. So, hey, that's tough, right? We look at the internally generated data. I used to work with a guy who was in the community forever, Seth Pinsky, and he used to have a great slide that said the only entity that creates more data, maybe, than a pharma with the same level of failures is NASA. You know, it's like how much data you guys actually generate as an entity is staggering. Then you have acquisition data. I always point this out as well. When I moved back east, I can remember having a list of our top 20 pharma customers. And it was Pharmacia, Park Davis, Upjohn. You know, they're all Pfizer now, right? And you know what happens with Pfizer when they bought Wyeth, it's well known. They pared down to 95% of the size of Pfizer. So not only did they lose all the people from Wyeth, they lost more people from Pfizer. Yes, you get some IP. That's a drug on the market. That's some value. But the data and the people who stored the data and the people who had the expertise, they're gone. So it goes in a box, never used ever again. What a waste, right? We have more and more of this. So the question just becomes, does data feed the beast? I feel bad Eric's not here. He had a reference to the $6 million man. I'm older. So I have a reference to Star Trek. And this was always one of my favorite things. These are the savages feeding Val. They feed him a bunch of rocks, and there's a computer in there, and if he gets enough rocks, he makes everybody smart for a minute. And it's like, that's kind of the idea, right? It just throws something into a computer, and a computer will somehow replace the ability of a scientist to figure things out. It's never going to happen, right? So how do we help those computers? I'll embarrassingly share our aha moment at Elsevier. So we were working with a guy named Laszlo Urban, who works for Nyber. He works for Novartis. And he's very well known in his field, and he was doing some work on predictive PK work. So he's making predictive PK models, and he's got a boatload of data, and he's thinking, well, maybe I can work with my friends at Elsevier because we've extracted all the PK data from all the EMA submissions and the FDA submissions that we have in one data set. And we bought this really cool company called Aureus Bioscience, and there's all sorts of extracted PK data from journals. So yeah, that's pretty easy. So we said, yeah, okay, no problem, we'll do that, we'll give it to you. And in giving it to him, we realized we couldn't even combine our own data sets. We couldn't look at these two things side by side and map them. They're totally unintegrated, totally disparate values, totally disparate searching capabilities. It's like, oh, how embarrassing. I mean, we're selling solutions to you guys with common data sets that you can't combine. So, yeah, that was a problem. So we looked at it and we said, all right, this is, you know, we've got some good things here. We've got experts. We've got 1,000 people working on taxonomy development, taxonomy management, data extraction, things that we took for granted because it just went into products, right? I mean, that was the end result. We still took them from completely disparate data sets, just like the ones you're looking at. Is there an opportunity for us here? Can we work together? So the first thing we're trying to do, or doing, is establishing the right model for the analysis and the insights, right? And this is great because I use this slide with another very large research company that's it's a global 500, but it's not in pharma. And they gave us this unbelievably detailed roadmap for what they wanted to do for their digital data strategy. And the very first thing is extract the data. And the guy said, yeah, the problem is we can't do anything else because we fail at number one. We can't even extract the data for all the rest of the stuff. Can you help us? So what we're trying to do is look at our processes, our ways of collecting the data, putting the data together before we do anything else, and seeing if those are processes that can be shared amongst the community. Then from there, we look at distilling the information, harmonizing the data, making sure that the data can be looked at through multiple lenses. That's one of the critical things for us, is to be able to say, if I'm a safety pharmacologist, I'm going to look at PK data one way. If I'm a biologist, I'm going to look at it another way. Equally, they have to be valued and they have to be contextually available to us. And then the find trends and derive insights. We're one of many, many, many providers of that context. So we don't want to corner the market in this. What we want to do is be able to make sure that whatever the community is using benefits from how we can work with others in the community, whether it's customers, whether it's foundations, whether it's organizations, to create some set of standards that will deliver on the promise of these Palantirs and IASDs. The Elsevier approach, we take it from a very practical approach. I mean, we have what's called the content enrichment framework. So no matter what data comes in, we've built what we believe a best-in-class extraction process. And I don't want to go into details. You can always grab me at lunch for this. And I go into painful detail, and I've got two of my smartest guys over here that can give you even more detail. What we do is we simply identify the data sets, identify all potential use cases for the data sets, and then run the data, run through, we have our own NLP systems, but we also use a number of other NLP systems on the market, both open source and commercial. Then we undergo a tremendous amount of manual processing. And it's the manual processing that we see oftentimes isn't really scalable. Again, I go back to the customer I was just referring to, and I said, we'll do the manual process. And he said, that's not really going to help me move my digital strategy needle. You know, all that's going to say is, you do what we're already doing a little better than we are. You know, is that really going to move the needle? Probably not. Let's think together about how we're going to move the needle on this. So what we've come up with, and again, it's a broader vision, it's a bolder vision, and it's one that's probably the biggest thing that Elsevier has taken on, is the semantic search engine, right? This is a way in which we will create a data store, a graph database, a data lake, however you want to describe it, a common ground that should be able to provide all of these lenses and facets for this data. We'll be, in marketing parlance, we'll be eating our own dog food. So we'll be doing this for chemistry, we'll be doing this for biology, we'll be doing this for drug safety. When we showed this to our advisory board, the first thing they said, and it was great feedback, the first thing they said is, wow, that's really great that you're doing this. We have absolutely no interest in your data lake or your data graph or anything, but can you expose those services to us? Can you expose the processes? And that's what we're in the process of doing. We're in the process of designing these processes, sharing them, validating them with the community, and ultimately making them available. Right? Whether you store it in our system or a MarkLogic system or a Cambridge semantic system or your own system, shouldn't matter. But being able to have this common way of processing the data, to be able to give multiple facets to an individual data piece is the critical thing and the thing that we're undertaking right now. We've got a number of cases that we're working on. And again, I'm happy to share these offline. I'll share the slides with you, but in much more detail with anybody that's interested. We're looking at ways in which we can take data sets and definitively show to the community, all right, here's 10 different ways to look at it. Let's work with one of your computational analytics pieces and see if this meets now your needs. Feeding in a combined set of data, whether it's our data, whether it's customer intent generated data, whether it's proprietary data, whether it's the public data. We'll take any data set and work with you on this. That's our key to make sure that A, it's a valid proposition, and B, that we can do it. I mean, the impact, as I said, is massive. I mean, there's a million different ways you could look at this. I don't know if any of you know Dongliang Yi. He was previously at Gilead as their head of bioinformatics, and he came from an academic background. He came from Duke, and he had such big plans because he said, I simply want to find out how many of our compounds got to phase 2 and re-examine them, knowing what we know now about patients. Somebody said yesterday about salvaging. I love that. I think it was Larry said salvaging. We can salvage drugs. And what an opportunity that is. You know, especially when you look at areas like rare diseases, where at the end of the day, unless we can dramatically cut down costs, none of you guys are going to be able to bring a drug to market for rare diseases, right? These are the opportunities that present themselves to us. Stephen showed some things. There's a number, and again, I freely admit I'm going to add all of the guys who were sitting up here's names to this. Pistoia, Allotrope, OpenFax, Transcelerate. There's a million of them. And I can tell you one thing. From an Elsevier perspective, I'd love somebody to sit on all of them, but we're not going to have that kind of resource availability. And being involved in one of these, or a number of these, I know that every one of your companies, or most of your companies, are involved in tons and tons of these, which is taking tons and tons of your people's time. It's not to say it's not valuable, but is there a better way we can work together? Work with IBM, work with the City of Hope, work with St. Jude, work together so that these standards, this information can be disseminated so that you guys can go about your job of getting a drug out to market. So just to conclude, there's a lot more that can be done with the data that we have. I had a number of use cases that would have gone into painful detail that I'm more than happy to share over lunch that can show you how we're doing it. Small examples addressing a very big problem. Bottom line is we haven't seen the product promise of analytics deliver a truly big win yet, right? I see every day the promise. Merck Europe is signing with Palantir. 50,000 more people are signing with IBM. We haven't seen the win, and I want to see it. I want to see it in my time in the industry. And I look and we talk about creating and collaborating on standards and data, creating a framework for success. I think that's the big thing. The understanding that we don't look at our data and parallel silos and tie those silos together into one big silo. That's great. but let's look at this through all of the potential facets that can be used across discovery. I think that's the big opportunity, and the one we haven't really discussed here, and the one that I think is the concern of Mark Ramsey or a Michael Dolston, the leaders in pharma, right? They don't want to get down to the nitty-gritty. They want to solve big problems, and I know so do you. Thanks, and I'm more than happy to take questions or any feedback.
Excellent presentations. Questions for Tim?
I know I'm standing between you and lunch, and I'll be standing out there at lunch, so.
Okay, I got one.
Sure.
When you look at a lot of you talk about context around the data, and you look around a lot of the where that's contained, and you look at the behaviors of project teams. And so you see a lot of the annotation, a lot of the context is in PowerPoints, right? And they're put on their SharePoint sites or different, and you see a wide variability into the level of detail different project team members put on their PowerPoints. And so the decisions of those teams are also put in project team minutes over here, others. So you miss a lot of that context, a lot of the rationale for why we made a decision. A lot of that goes to kind of documentation behaviors. We've gotten away from kind of the technical reports that we used to do in Discovery years ago. How do you deal with that? I mean, there's a technology aspect, but there's a behavior aspect of those teams that need to facilitate the technology.
Yeah, I mean, we talk a little bit about the V's, and you get down to the 9 V's at that point, right? I mean, there's such a disparity. I mean, you can look at some level of algorithmic weighting based on, you pull out something as simple as a set of triples, and I'm missing certain things where I don't have the complete set of triples, bring that down in value. There's weighting mechanisms that you can use, but there's nothing that's going to address the gap in the data. That's the terrible part. This is why I felt pretty strongly, again, personally, that how much of the science that we simply don't look at because it's in a black box somewhere that came from Wyeth that's now at a Pfizer storeroom in Iron Mountain, is there something there that will fill in those gaps? Right? To me, and there's going to be evolutions in technology. There's going to be deep learning, something that's going to read enough or understand enough that maybe it can propose how to fill in those gaps. Kind of, I mean, we're in San Diego, we talk about Craig Venter, right? We sequenced the genome, found a bunch of gaps. What does that mean? We have no idea. Absolutely no idea. But maybe we will. And that's, I mean, I don't want to talk too futuristic, but that is the promise of deep learning, right? Of machine learning, not necessarily of AI. But if it reads enough things in similar context and sees a gap, ideally it would be able to propose a gap. But there's no solution for that right now.
Well, when we talk about standards, I'm always curious about that expectations that a governing body will define kind of data standards, but what we fail to define standards around in many cases, I think Eric talked about this a bit, was the data governance, the data processes, the curation, the stewardship, what you should document, project team. This is kind of your minimal level of documentation to be able to facilitate the technology. And I think, and so I'm always interested in that gap. How do we get through that and not expecting kind of a standards body to decide a format that it's also, we have to change our behaviors and our practices to be able to facilitate that?
I mean, I wish I had a better answer, but I can certainly give an example of where we, the publishing community, have really led the way down. Yeah. We did a very interesting survey just looking at articles, scientific articles published 25 years ago and compared them with what's being published now. And what's being published now is we filled up the plates, we put in the assays, here are the results. Very little context, very little hypothesis, very little to say why. Why were you doing this? What was the expectation? And that, I think, goes a long way when we're advancing on what we already know. We have to get back into the capturing why we're doing something. And this is something that we are pushing on, at least internally with our company. But everybody that's publishing, you know, the pressure to publish, the pressure to just get things out, more people publishing, you're losing a lot of the context of the science. And, you know, science and academia has not overlooked context. We hear small a academic research, it's not like corporate research. They always have a goal, they have an end game. So I mean, that's about all I can say to it. We've been guilty as anybody, or more so, and we need to address that internally with our constituents, because ultimately, otherwise all you get is you might as well just get a spreadsheet.
Or you get what Watson just did with MD Anderson, right?
Yeah, yeah, you just get a dump.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. I can probably hear you.
Well, I don't know if anybody else.
Oh, fair enough.
That's the reason. Excellent presentation. So I think if you look at the hieroglyphics and the Rosetta Stone, right, until the Rosetta Stone was found, nobody knew how to decipher it. So in that theme, you heard all these consortiums and standards. What are your thoughts about thinking of a cipher or a Rosetta Stone so that you can make it a more, like, I heard this graph from data to wisdom, and that was an excellent graph. So to jump from knowledge to wisdom, it's almost philosophical. You almost kind of feel your way through it. So have you, any thoughts, have you talked to any CEOs, people who move the money to get drugs to the patient?
I'd actually, I mean, that's great because it gives me an opportunity to show that I read a book at one point. But rather than going to the Rosetta Stone, I'd actually use the analogy of Fermat's enigma, right? Where A squared plus times B squared equals C squared, but no other, they had to prove that no other exponent was true, right? Somebody put up $50,000 prize, which became a $3 million prize and took 100 years to solve. The way that was solved was one guy took two completely disparate mathematical formulas and realized that if I somehow kludge these together, this will prove my thing. It wasn't a Rosetta Stone. It was putting together two completely disparate things to realize that aha moment. I don't think there's going to be a single cipher, a single vocabulary, a single methodology, but I do think that if we take a step back and look at the problem, right, talk to the people who are working with the supercomputers, talk to those people, and look at the outcomes that they're expecting, then maybe it's going to be a little bit different, right? I mean, the idea with when I was at Netscape and got to meet Tim Berners-Lee, and he had a great point. His point was from any single piece of information, 10 people are going to look at that and expect the next click to be 10 completely different things. How do we get to that point? Google kind of does it, but they do it ex post facto, and then they push that to the next set of clicks or the next set of recommendations. But I think that, I mean, it's going to be trial and error at this point until literally some really smart person is going to have a different perspective on the problem. And that's why I like to just keep coming back to what's the problem we're really trying to solve? What's the objective? I like the example John Baldoni had of working with McLaren. Did it work? Not yet, but it shows out-of-the-box thinking. I mean, if you ask an engineer to answer a question like me, you're going to get an engineer's answer, right? That might or might not be the right way of doing it, because chances are you've had engineers' answers all along, right? So, I mean, I wish I had a better answer for you. If I did, I wouldn't publish it. I'd make it freely available, I promise.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, so thank you very much, Tim.
Thanks.